For this week's video, we're going to be looking at the Haitian Revolution. So previously we've looked at the Age of Revolutions, really focusing on the American Revolution, the French Revolution, as well as revolutionary ideas, things like abolition. So for this week, we're going to look at the Haitian Revolution. So to give you a little bit of background, you can see that this is what Saint-Domingue looks like. And that's what we're referring to when we talk about Haiti, because Saint-Domingue, before the revolution, is going to be the richest colony in the West Indies. It's a French colony. It's probably one of the richest colonies that has ever existed. And again, a lot of that goes back to sugar. We talked about sugar earlier in the semester when we were looking at the rise of plantation systems, and Saint-Domingue is definitely going to be part of this system. The entire economy in Saint-Domingue is based around this plantation system, which of course has slave labor. So Saint-Domingue, not only do they produce sugar, but they also produce coffee, indigo, tobacco, cotton, as well as some other fruits and vegetables, but mainly they are focused on sugar. So I have a map up here of Saint-Domingue. And again, this is French at this point, and it has been French for a while. So a treaty formally ceded the western third of Hispaniola from Spain to France, which they renamed Saint-Domingue. So that's what we're looking at when we're talking about the Haitian Revolution. So as far as the reasons for the Haitian Revolution, there are a lot of sort of causes in this lead up. And the French Revolution is going to be an event that is very important for looking at the Haitian Revolution. So with the French Revolution, you can see that there are a lot of people who are starting to think about the rights of man and thinking about what those rights mean. In addition to that, you have to understand a little bit about what the social hierarchy in Saint-Domingue looks like at this point. At the very top, you have what are known as the Grand Blanc. These are white planters. They are, for the most part, very, very wealthy. They own these really massively large plantations that are almost like running like a factory style, and they're huge. And they want home rule because of the French Revolution. Essentially, they don't believe that the French monarch or the French, government even would be able to provide for them in their basic needs. So they want to be more independent. So they're calling for this independence. In addition to that, you have the Petit Blancs, and these are small farmers. So they live on Saint-Domingue, but they don't own these massive plantations. But don't let that make you think that these are just like poor little farmers who are farming for their basic needs. Most of them still own slaves. They're still relatively wealthy compared to other people who are living in the colonies. But they want to have more rights. They want to be equal to these Grand Blancs and these planters. So that's, of course, going to help in the lead up to the Haitian Revolution. In addition to that, you can see that a decree in May of 1791 granted full citizenship to all free blacks of free parents, and this raises the expectations of slaves. So in addition to having the Grand Blanc, Petit Blanc, you are also going to have the gens de couleur, which are free blacks who are living in Saint-Domingue. Now, when we think about what's happening with former slaves or freed slaves, so often we think that they are doing really poorly, they're not doing very well, they don't have any money, but that's not necessarily the case in Saint-Domingue. There are a lot of the gens de couleur who are either of mixed parentage or, they might be completely of African ancestry, but regardless, a lot of them are doing relatively well. In some cases, you will see that there are some gens de couleur who have more property and who have more invested in the economy of Saint-Domingue than the small farmers that we just talked about. And so they really want to have this same type of equality that the Grand Blanc and the Petit Blanc have. So they start to push for more rights, and this also starts to raise the expectation for slaves. So you can see that when we think about the Haitian Revolution, there are racial, class, and colonial conflicts that are coming into play. So as far as the revolution really getting started and just thinking about the revolution in general, there are a couple of things for us to think about. So there were bands of runaway slaves known as Maroons who they sort of fled to the colony's mountains and forest, and they are going to sort of help lead the charge against the white plantations. And they are going to sometimes attack these plantations. They have weapons oftentimes, and their numbers are really starting to grow as more slaves are starting to desert their plantations. In addition to that, you can see that the Petit Blanc and the Grand Blanc are starting to come a little bit more into conflict with each other, and both of those groups are starting to come into contact with the gens de couleur because they don't believe that they should have the same rights as them based on their skin color and their birthright. They don't believe that they should have equality. So what ends up happening is that you are going to see that all sides of this revolution, again, on all fronts, they are going to start arming their slaves because they are relatively nervous and upset about what's taking place. And since the slaves make up the majority of the population, a lot of plantation owners, small farmers, whatever it might be, believe that they will be better off if their slaves are armed and if they would be able to help them in the event of any sort of attack. So that's going to be very important as well. However, initially you're going to see that the enslaved lack any sort of real central revolution. And when the revolution gets started, a lot of the slaves who emerge as leaders are slaves that had positions of power. So they were very close with the plantation owners. They were trusted slaves, slaves that would have been considered to be very good slaves by their masters. However, these are also the ones who have more access to information, knowledge, and that type of thing. So eventually you are going to see that Toussaint Louverture is going to rise as the leader of the enslaved. So he's going to become a military leader. And he insists on discipline, and he is going to be very, very important for organizing the slaves. And what the slaves are going to do is that they are going to torch property, fields, factories, and anything else that belong to or help to serve slave owners. The rebellion in itself, the Haitian Revolution, left around 10,000 blacks and 2,000 whites dead and more than 1,000 plantations sacked or razed. So Toussaint is going to be very instrumental in helping to organize and push things out. Now, if you want to know more about the Haitian Revolution itself, I've also linked another video to this week's assessments. So you can feel free to go through and look at that. However, you can also send me an email and I'll be happy to send you another video that goes more into the actual details. For this video, I wanted us to see more of like the lead up and then also what happens in the aftermath of the revolution itself. But with Toussaint Louverture, where he was the leader in this revolution, he is eventually named governor in 1799. And we'll talk more about what he does as governor in just a second. But just to give you sort of a brief recap of what else is happening towards the end of this revolution, in 1802, Napoleon tries to recapture Haiti. And when he invades, he invites Louverture to a conference and he accepts. And once he accepts, he is going to be arrested because the French found him to be increasingly dangerous, especially since they are trying to take Haiti back. But he ends up dying in a French prison in 1803. Once Louverture is sort of out of the way as far as the French are concerned, you're going to see another man named Jean-Jacques Dessalines who is going to take over the Haitian army after Louverture's capture. And eventually that army is going to be able to defeat the French on November 18th of 1803. And by January 1st of 1804, Haiti is going to declare itself a republic, meaning that it is going to be completely independent of the French. Now, what I want to talk about more for the rest of this video is sort of the impact of the Haitian Revolution. So as far as the economic implications of the Haitian Revolution, things are not going to be very good for Haiti as it emerges as an independent area. So, first, they're going to go bankrupt. There's a disturbance of their economic system, especially with all of the plantations that were burned, the land that was desecrated. There are a lot of issues with that. In addition to that, different nations are going to choose not to trade with Haiti because, number one, it's a very poor area and doesn't have as much to offer anymore. And in addition to that, they want to keep their trade relationship open with the French, so they don't want to step on any toes in that way. They also are going to be focused more on circulating goods in the States as opposed to exportation. And it's important to understand that even though this was a revolution that was supposed to lead to better class distribution and it was between these classes, it actually made the rich more wealthy and the poor were even more poor. And in addition to that, there were also the many freed slaves. And that brings up the question of what should happen to the former slaves. Now, these are the people who have just gone in and they have fought this revolution and they have fought really hard in order to gain their freedom. However, that does not mean that land is going to be distributed equally among these former slaves. And in addition to that, in order to keep the plantation system as in check as possible, Louverture, when he ends up creating the Constitution for Haiti, he basically mandates that any former slave is going to be required to continue working on either small-scale farms or plantations, that agriculture is supposed to be the basis of their economy, and that people have to sign contracts and they're going to have to continue working on these plantations, or again, the more small scale farms. So for a lot of people, it doesn't seem that much different than slavery because they're not paid very well. Sometimes they're paid just in their room and board or just in food. So they're not going to be paid very well, and they're still forced to work for people who are wealthier. As far as the social implications, the slaves were freed. So even though they do have to, sign these contracts and work for the same people, they're going to be able to take control of the island in the sense that they are going to be able to be in charge, have more say in the government and things like that. In addition to that, you can see that the roles are somewhat flipped. A lot of the whites are going to be persecuted by the former slaves during the Revolution, and because of that, a lot of them are going to end up fleeing to places in the U.S. or Canada. For example, Louisiana, which was still French at this point, is going to have a lot of the planters from Haiti that are going to come to Louisiana. Other slave nations in the area are also going to be persuaded to attempt revolts themselves. You're going to have many, many different slave revolts that are going to take place after the Haitian Revolution, although they won't be quite as successful. And you can see that people who are the gens de couleur, or people who are of mixed race, a lot of times they are going to become the elite. They are going to take over some of the bigger plantations, and a lot of them already have an education before the revolt even took place. So they're going to be the ones who are coming into power socially. As far as the political implications, eventually they achieve autonomy from France, although as we have seen, that's not necessarily a good thing as far as trade relationships. It also became a very poor country ruled by a king and a wealthy elite, which, if you had looked at the initial stages of the Haitian Revolution, where the Grand Blancs are trying to gain freedom from the French, they might not have wanted to have created a government where you have one person and a wealthy elite who are controlling everything. However, it's important because this is still the first free Black nation. It is still going to be run by people who were formerly enslaved or formerly restricted because of the government. But politically, this is also only the second independent state in the Western Hemisphere that is going to be able to get away from their colonial rule. So it's all very important, but as you can see just by looking at these various ideas, the Haitian Revolution definitely has a lot of issues that come because of it. But regardless, it is still a successful slave revolt, and I think that's something that is important to keep in mind. So this is the only successful slave rebellion, but it also puts a lot of fear into the hearts of slave holding and trading nations. And that's very important. After the Haitian Revolution, you are going to see laws that are going to be enacted in places like Great Britain and the US, as well as in a lot of the colonies, where they are no longer going to be importing African slaves directly from Africa. The reason for this is because the Haitian Revolution, a lot of the slaves who were active in the revolution were actually from the Congo, and they were military experts from the Congo. So because of that, a lot of other nations start to realize that if they are importing slaves directly from Africa, they might too face the challenge of the fact that a lot of these areas where they're being imported from, remember from the past few weeks when we've looked at the impact of the trade on Africa and things like that, these are groups that are military based now, and they know about strategies, they know about weapons, different things like that. So you're going to see a lot of different laws put into place like that. In addition to that, Haiti also becomes the second independent nation in the New World, but we've already talked about that. However, the Haitian Revolution, more so than even the American or French revolutions, is going to sort of set this precedent in these colonies, both French, British, Spanish, to sort of say, you know, this is possible, you can have these revolutions, and sort of sets the tone for them as well. And we're going to look at those a little bit more next week. Few Western nations are going to encourage trade with Haiti, and this is going to lead to a long-standing tradition of economic isolation and stagnation. And if we're thinking about the impact of this revolution on Haiti, it becomes a very poor nation because of this lack of trade, and it's something that continues even through many decades later. So it's going to really hinder the growth of Haiti as a nation. But overall, you can see that there are definitely positives to this revolution. The former slaves are going to be free. However, you can also see one negative is that while they are free, the Constitution that's put into place doesn't necessarily allow them to have the enjoyment of that freedom. In addition to that, you can see that while this is going to be the second independent nation that breaks away from its mother country, this revolution doesn't necessarily lead to economic well-being, as opposed to the American Revolution, where once they are able to break free, they are still able to be traders in the world market. So it's definitely something to keep in mind and think about. So for this week's assignments, the assessment is like normal. It's based on the reading that you have, the secondary source reading. And for the primary sources, there are several different views of the revolution that are included in that primary source set. So remember, always reply to somebody who had a different source from you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know, and I will talk to you in the next video.